I've lived in Millbrook my entire life, and I thought I knew every corner of our small town. What I discovered in our century-old Carnegie Library on October 15, 2024, made me realize how little any of us really know about the places we call home, and the people who run them. My name is Sarah, and I'd been working as the evening librarian for 3 years. Millbrook only has about 4,800 residents, so our library was more than just a place for books. It was the heart of our community. The building itself was a beautiful stone structure from 1923, with tall windows, oak shelving, and that distinctive old book smell that made everyone feel at home. That Tuesday evening started like any other. I was alone, which was normal for the 6 to 9 p.m. shift. Mrs. Henderson, our head librarian for the past 15 years, had left around 5:30 after reminding me about the board meeting the next day. The rain was coming down hard outside, which meant I'd probably have a quiet evening with maybe 2 or 3 patrons at most. Around 7:15, I was shelving returns in the biography section when I heard it, a distinct sound coming from somewhere below me. Not unusual, exactly, since old buildings make noise, but this was different. It sounded like furniture being moved. Heavy furniture. I paused, listening carefully. The sound came again, definitely from beneath the main floor. But here's the thing, I'd worked there for 3 years, and I'd never known about any basement or storage area below the library. The utility room was adjacent to the main space, not underneath it. The building plans showed the library as a single-story structure built on a concrete slab. The sound stopped, so I went back to my work. But 20 minutes later, I heard voices. Muffled, but definitely multiple people talking. And they were coming from below. I'll admit, my first thought was that maybe there was some kind of maintenance access I didn't know about. Millbrook's infrastructure was old, and there were always city workers dealing with water main issues or electrical problems. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had forgotten to mention scheduled work. But it was after 7:30 p.m., and no city maintenance happened after hours without advance notice to the library staff. Plus, if there were workers below, how had they gotten access? I was the only one in the building, and I'd locked the main doors behind the last patron at 7 p.m. I tried to focus on closing procedures, but the voices continued. Not loud enough to make out words, but persistent. And every few minutes, I'd hear that furniture moving sound again, like heavy wooden chairs or tables being dragged across a floor. Around 8:15, with 45 minutes left in my shift, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate the utility room more thoroughly. Maybe there was an access panel or door I'd never noticed. The utility room was cramped and dimly lit, filled with the usual collection of cleaning supplies, extra paper for the printer, and seasonal decorations. I'd been in there hundreds of times. But that night, crouched down behind the water heater with my phone's flashlight, I noticed something that made no sense. The floor wasn't concrete like the rest of the building. It was wood. Old, worn wooden planks that looked like they'd been there for decades. I knelt down and ran my hands along the boards. About 4 feet from the water heater, I found what I was looking for, a section where the planks were slightly raised, as if they formed some kind of hatch or trapdoor. There was even a small metal ring, painted over so many times it was barely visible, but definitely designed to be pulled. The voices below had stopped, but I could still hear occasional movement. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to call Mrs. Henderson, but what would I say? I think there's a secret basement under the library. It sounded crazy. Finally, I decided to lift the hatch just enough to see what was underneath. If it was just a utility crawl space or storage area, I'd close it and forget about it. If it was something else, I'd call the police. The hatch was heavier than expected, but it lifted smoothly, as if it had been used recently. Below was a wooden ladder leading down into darkness. The air that came up was warm and carried a strange smell, not musty like you'd expect from a basement, but almost clinical, like a doctor's office or hospital. I shined my phone light down and could see the ladder ended on what looked like a carpeted floor about 8 feet below. The space extended beyond what my light could reach, but I could make out the edge of what appeared to be furniture, the corner of a desk or table. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not above me in the library, but below, in whatever space I'd just discovered. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across that carpeted floor. And they were getting closer to the ladder. I dropped the hatch shut as quietly as possible and scrambled backward, my heart hammering. Someone was definitely down there. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there, in a space that officially didn't exist. I grabbed my keys and phone and headed for the main desk, planning to call 911. But as I passed the large front windows, I saw something that stopped me cold. Mrs. Henderson's car was parked across the street under the old elm tree. She'd left over 2 hours ago, but her dark blue Honda was definitely there, and someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I stepped back from the window, staying in the shadows. If Mrs. Henderson was still here, why hadn't she come back into the library? Why was she sitting in her car in the rain? And what was her connection to the voices I'd heard underneath the building? My phone showed 8:47 p.m. 13 minutes until closing time. I had to make a decision, confront this situation or pretend I'd never discovered anything. I chose a middle path. I went through my normal closing routine, but instead of leaving through the front door like usual, I slipped out the back emergency exit, which I knew wouldn't set off the alarm if opened from inside. I made my way around the building, staying in the shadows, and positioned myself where I could see both Mrs. Henderson's car and the library's main entrance. At exactly 9 p.m., the front door opened. But it wasn't Mrs. Henderson who came out. It was Tom Brennan, our mayor, followed by Dr. Patricia Wells, who ran the local medical clinic. Behind them came Mrs. Henderson, and then two people I didn't recognize, a man in an expensive suit and a woman carrying what looked like a briefcase or a small suitcase. They stood under the front awning for a moment, talking in low voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the rain, but their body language was tense, serious. The woman with the briefcase handed something to Dr. Wells, an envelope or folder of some kind. Then they separated. The two strangers got into a black SUV I hadn't noticed before and drove away. Dr. Wells walked to her own car and left. Mayor Brennan and Mrs. Henderson talked for another minute before he got into his truck and she got into her Honda. I waited until all the cars were gone before I came out of hiding. My mind was racing. 5 people had been in the library after hours, in a space I'd never known existed. 3 of them were prominent community members, including my boss. The next morning, I arrived at work trying to act normal. Mrs. Henderson was already there, going through the daily routine like nothing had happened. I studied her carefully, looking for any sign that she knew I'd discovered something, but she seemed completely normal. "How was your evening shift?" she asked casually while updating the calendar at the front desk. "Quiet," I said. "Just a few patrons before closing." She nodded. "Good. Oh, I forgot to mention, we're having some foundation work done over the next few weeks. A contractor needs to access some utility areas, so don't be surprised if you hear some construction noise occasionally." Foundation work. That was her explanation for what I'd witnessed. "When will they be working?" I asked. "Evening hours mostly, to avoid disrupting library operations. Nothing you need to worry about." I spent the rest of my shift thinking about what I'd seen and heard. 5 people, including our mayor and the local doctor, having secret meetings in a hidden space below our library. An envelope or folder being passed between them. Mrs. Henderson now claiming there would be foundation work happening in the evenings. But what really bothered me was something else, something I hadn't fully processed until later that morning. When I was crouched by that trapdoor, listening to the footsteps below, I'd heard something else. Just for a moment, barely audible over the rain and the sound of movement, I'd heard what sounded like someone crying. Not loud, desperate crying, but quiet, defeated sobbing. The kind of sound someone makes when they've given up hope. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I researched the history of our library building. What I found in the town records made my blood run cold. The Carnegie Library was built in 1923, but it wasn't the first structure on that site. From 1895 to 1922, the same location housed the Millbrook Private Sanatorium, a medical facility that specialized in treating nervous disorders and female hysteria. The sanatorium was closed abruptly in 1922 following what the records called administrative irregularities, but no specific details were provided. When the library was built the following year, the construction records showed they incorporated some of the existing foundation and basement structures from the sanatorium for cost efficiency. But the final architectural plans showed no basement or sublevel areas. Someone had deliberately removed any evidence of what was below the library. As I sat there reading those old records, I realized I was dealing with something much bigger than a simple case of unauthorized after-hours access. This wasn't just about Mrs. Henderson, or even the mayor. This was about a century-old secret that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. And now I was the only person who knew about it. That evening, I had to work another closing shift. As 6 p.m. approached, I felt genuinely afraid. Would they be back? Would Mrs. Henderson realize I'd discovered something? And most importantly, who had been crying in that hidden space beneath the library? I went to work that night carrying a small digital recorder in my pocket, planning to document whatever I witnessed. But when I arrived, there was a note on my desk. Sarah, family emergency, need you to close early tonight. Lock up at 7 p.m. Thanks, Mrs. H. She never asked me to close early before. Never left a handwritten note instead of calling. And she'd signed it. Mrs. H. Something she'd never done in 3 years. I locked the doors at 7 p.m. as instructed, but I didn't leave. Instead, I hid in the stacks, behind the tall shelves in the local history section where I had a clear view of the utility room but couldn't be seen from the main areas. At 7:30, I heard the back door open. Footsteps crossed the main floor, and I saw flashlight beams moving toward the utility room. At least 3 people, maybe 4, all moving quietly and efficiently like they'd done this many times before. 20 minutes later, I heard the voices again. But this time, I could make out some words. Someone was giving instructions about patient files and storage protocols. Another voice mentioned the Wells Clinic and monthly reports. Dr. Wells. Our local doctor was involved in whatever was happening below the library. But the voice that made my blood freeze was the one that said, "The new girl might be a problem. She's been here 3 years, but Henderson thinks she's getting suspicious." They were talking about me. I stayed hidden until after 10 p.m., when I finally heard them leave. The next morning, I called in sick and spent the day trying to decide what to do. Going to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but what if Mayor Brennan was involved? What if Dr. Wells was part of some larger conspiracy? I decided to confide in my older sister, who lived 2 towns over and worked as a social worker. I told her everything I'd discovered, and her response surprised me. "Sarah," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Last month, I had a case involving a missing person from Millbrook. A young woman named Rebecca Morris. Her family said she'd been struggling with depression and had been seeing Dr. Wells for treatment. The last anyone saw her, she was going to an appointment at the clinic. Dr. Wells claimed she never showed up, but her car was found in the library parking lot." Rebecca Morris. I remembered her. She'd been a regular patron, always checking out self-help books and psychology texts. I hadn't seen her in months, but I'd assumed she'd just found other interests. The case was closed when Dr. Wells provided documentation showing Rebecca had been transferred to a psychiatric facility in the state capital. My sister continued. But when I followed up, that facility had no record of her ever being admitted. The pieces were starting to come together. A doctor with access to medical records and psychiatric documentation. A mayor who could influence police investigations. A librarian who controlled access to a building with hidden spaces. And patients who disappeared without a trace. "What should I do?" I asked my sister. "You need to get evidence," she said. "Real evidence. And then you need to take it to the state police, not the local authorities." That night, I prepared for what I knew might be my last shift at the Millbrook Library. I had a plan, but it was dangerous. I was going to get into that hidden space below the library and document whatever I found there. What I discovered in those underground rooms would expose a conspiracy that had been operating in our small town for decades, one that involved some of our most trusted community leaders and explained why several young people had mysteriously moved away from Millbrook over the past few years. But that's a story for another time. Right now, I need to ask you something. What's the strangest thing you've noticed about your own town's most trusted institutions? Have you ever wondered what happens in the places you're not supposed to see, the basements, the back rooms, the spaces that don't appear on any official building plans? Because sometimes, the most horrifying discoveries are hiding right beneath the places we consider safe. What I found under the Millbrook Library changed everything I thought I knew about my hometown. And it made me realize that in small towns, the people you trust most might be the ones with the darkest secrets to hide. 3 weeks after discovering the secret basement beneath Millbrook Library, I thought I understood the scope of what I was dealing with. I was wrong. What I learned about our mayor, Tom Brennan, on November 8, 2024, revealed that the conspiracy went far deeper than hidden rooms and missing persons. It involved systematic deception of our entire community, and the deliberate endangerment of everyone who called Millbrook home. My name is David Chen, and I've been a city planner for Millbrook for 7 years. When Sarah Martinez contacted me through my sister, I initially thought her story about the library was far-fetched. But what she showed me, combined with what I'd been noticing in my own work, painted a picture of municipal corruption that made my blood run cold. I'd been seeing irregularities in city planning documents for months, discrepancies that individually seemed like clerical errors, but together formed a pattern of deliberate deception. It started with building permits. Over the past 2 years, I'd processed dozens of applications for minor renovations that never made sense. Properties supposedly needing new electrical work when their systems had been updated recently. Basement excavations for foundation repairs on buildings that had passed structural inspections months before. Most concerning were the permits for the Wells Medical Clinic. Dr. Patricia Wells had submitted paperwork for expanding her facility 3 times in 18 months, each for additional patient rooms and specialized treatment areas. But when I drove by the clinic, it looked exactly the same. No construction activity, no visible changes. Every permit was approved personally by Mayor Brennan, bypassing the normal review process that required my sign-off as the city's planning coordinator. When Sarah showed me photos of that hidden basement entrance, and told me about seeing the mayor leaving the library after hours, pieces clicked into place. I needed to investigate what was really happening with these approved permits. November 8th was cold and rainy, perfect weather for what I planned. I told my supervisor I was conducting routine permit compliance inspections, which was part of my normal duties. What I didn't mention was that I'd be focusing on properties connected to Mayor Brennan's personally approved permits. My first stop was the Wells Medical Clinic. When I arrived around 10 a.m., the clinic appeared normal. The receptionist recognized me and was friendly enough, but when I explained I was there for a permit compliance inspection, her demeanor changed completely. "Dr. Wells isn't available right now," she said, despite the fact that I could see the doctor through her open office door, clearly visible and not with a patient. "I just need to verify the completed work matches the approved permits," I replied. The receptionist looked genuinely panicked. "All inspections need to be scheduled in advance. Dr. Wells' policy." That was unusual. Municipal inspectors had the right to conduct compliance checks during business hours without advance notice. Any legitimate medical facility would accommodate such inspections routinely. The receptionist immediately made a phone call, speaking in low tones. Within 5 minutes, she told me Dr. Wells had been called away for a medical emergency. But I'd been watching, and Dr. Wells never left her office. I left but parked down the street to observe. At 11:15 a.m., Mayor Brennan's truck pulled into the clinic's back parking area. He went in through the rear entrance and stayed 20 minutes. When he left, I followed him. Brennan drove to 3 other locations that morning, all properties with his personally approved permits. The old Murphy house on Elm Street, the vacant warehouse on Industrial Road, and finally, City Hall itself. That last stop made everything crystal clear. I waited until Brennan left, then used my employee access to enter the building. As city planner, I had keys to the basement storage rooms where we kept archived documents. But when I went downstairs, I found something that shouldn't have existed. Behind the normal storage area, accessed through a door I'd never noticed, was a fully equipped office space. Multiple desks, filing cabinets, computer equipment, and telecommunications gear far more sophisticated than anything the city officially owned. On one desk, I found documents that made my stomach turn. Medical records. Dozens of them, for people I recognized as current and former Millbrook residents. But these weren't normal medical files. They contained detailed psychological evaluations, medication schedules, and treatment plans for adjustment disorders and social integration difficulties. Many names were people I knew personally. Rebecca Morris, who Sarah had mentioned as missing. James Patterson, who had supposedly moved to Florida last year. Maria Santos, who'd apparently transferred to a facility in the state capital. But also names of people still living in Millbrook, people I saw around town regularly. The files suggested they were all receiving ongoing psychiatric medication and monitoring, administered through Dr. Wells' clinic under the Millbrook Community Health Initiative. There was no such program. I would have known any municipal health program would require city planning approval. As I photographed the documents, I found something even more disturbing: architectural plans for underground facilities at multiple locations throughout Millbrook. The library basement was just one of several connected underground spaces secretly constructed over the past decade. The Wells Clinic had a sub-basement connecting to the old Murphy house. The warehouse had an underground level connecting to tunnels beneath Main Street. All of it connected back to this secret facility underneath City Hall. The plans were signed by Mayor Brennan and approved by someone identified as State Coordinator Project Millbrook. There was contact information for something called the Borough Community Wellness Research Initiative. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs above me. I quickly replaced the documents and moved toward the regular storage area, but wasn't fast enough. Mayor Brennan appeared in the doorway, and he didn't look surprised to see me. "David," he said calmly, "I was wondering when you'd find your way down here." I tried to act casual. "Just looking for some old survey maps." He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "In the secure storage area?" "David, we both know you're too smart to be down here by accident." Brennan moved closer, carrying what looked like a radio. He spoke into it. "We have a situation in the basement." Chin discovered the office. A voice crackled back. "Bring him to the clinic. Wells is prepped for intake." My blood went cold. They were talking about me like I was a patient, not a city employee who discovered criminal activity. "I should probably get back to work," I said, moving toward the stairs. Brennan blocked my path. "David, you're upset? You're clearly having some kind of episode. Dr. Wells has been concerned about your mental state for weeks. She mentioned you've seemed paranoid, suspicious, making accusations about permit irregularities." I had never spoken to Dr. Wells about my work. But I realized that didn't matter. They were creating a narrative to explain away anything I might say about what I'd discovered. The good news is that we have excellent treatment programs for people experiencing your type of psychological distress. Dr. Wells has helped many community members work through similar issues. People like Rebecca Morris. People who'd been labeled as having adjustment disorders, and subsequently disappeared. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of arguing, I pretended to agree. "You're right," I said, trying to sound defeated. "I have been feeling paranoid lately. Maybe I should talk to Dr. Wells." Brennan's expression relaxed. "That's a good decision, David. She's expecting you." I let him escort me out of City Hall, but as we walked to his truck, I was formulating a plan. I had photos on my phone and enough information to expose what was happening. But first, I had to survive whatever they planned for me at the clinic. When we arrived, Dr. Wells was waiting at the back entrance. She greeted me with professional warmth, but I could see calculation in her eyes. "David, Tom tells me you've been having difficulties lately. Why don't we sit down and talk?" I was escorted into a room I'd never seen before, a small office that looked more like an interrogation room than medical space. No windows, minimal furniture, and recording equipment mounted in the corners. Dr. Wells asked questions about my work, stress levels, and recent paranoid ideation regarding city planning procedures. I answered carefully, trying to sound confused and seeking help. After 20 minutes, she excused herself to consult on my treatment plan. When she returned, she carried a medical bag and consent form. "David, I'm recommending immediate intervention for your acute stress reaction. I'm going to administer a mild sedative to help you relax." I knew that if I let her inject me with anything, I would end up like Rebecca Morris and the others. "Dr. Wells, before we do anything medical, I should call my insurance company to check coverage for mental health treatment." She hesitated. "David, this is a crisis intervention. We can handle paperwork later. My policy has specific requirements for pre-authorization. It'll just take a minute." I pulled out my phone, but instead of calling insurance, I called 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is David Chin at the Wells Medical Clinic in Millbrook. I'm being held against my will and someone is trying to forcibly medicate me." Dr. Wells lunged for the phone, but I was faster. I ran for the door and found myself in a hallway I'd never seen before during previous visits. The hallway led to a staircase going down, confirmation that the clinic had the basement level shown in those plans. I could hear voices below and electronic equipment. But I didn't investigate. I ran for the main clinic and out the front door, Dr. Wells and Mayor Brennan shouting behind me. The 911 dispatcher was still on the line. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching. When police arrived, it was Officer Martinez, someone I'd seen in Mayor Brennan's office multiple times. I realized I couldn't trust local police. I told Officer Martinez there had been a misunderstanding, and that I was fine. As soon as he left, I drove straight to the state police barracks 30 miles away and reported everything. The state investigation that followed revealed the scope of what had been happening in Millbrook. Mayor Brennan, Dr. Wells, and other community leaders had been operating an illegal medical research program targeting residents considered problematic or non-compliant. People who asked too many questions or seemed suspicious of authority were systematically labeled as mentally ill and subjected to experimental treatments designed to make them compliant, or remove them from the community entirely. The underground facilities were part of a network funded by a pharmaceutical company testing psychiatric medications and behavioral modification techniques on unwilling subjects. Millbrook had been selected because of its small size and ability to control information flow. Over 5 years, more than 20 residents had been subjected to this program. Some had been declared, transferred, and were actually held in underground facilities. Others had been given medications that altered their personalities so significantly they became compliant and stopped asking questions. The investigation revealed that several accidental deaths and suicides in Millbrook had actually been adverse reactions to experimental medications or escape attempts. Mayor Brennan was arrested on charges of conspiracy, unlawful imprisonment, and administering controlled substances without consent. Dr. Wells faced similar charges plus medical ethics violations. The pharmaceutical company executives were charged with human experimentation violations. But what haunted me most was realizing how many neighbors had been victims without anyone noticing. People whose personalities had gradually changed, who'd become quieter and withdrawn. I'd attributed it to normal life changes, not systematic drugging and psychological manipulation. The rescue of people held in underground facilities made national news, and Millbrook became known as the site of one of the most extensive illegal human experimentation operations in modern U.S. history. But here's what still keeps me awake. The program had operated for 5 years before discovery. 5 years during which trusted community leaders systematically preyed on their own residents, and nobody noticed the pattern. It made me realize that the people we trust most sometimes have the most power to deceive us. In small towns, where everyone thinks they know everyone else, it's easier to hide terrible secrets because people don't want to believe their neighbors are capable of such things. What's the most disturbing thing you've learned about your own community leaders? Have you ever noticed residents whose personalities seem to change dramatically over time? Because sometimes, the most horrifying conspiracies are hiding in plain sight, perpetrated by the very people we elected to protect us. What happened in Millbrook changed how I view authority and community trust. And it made me realize that sometimes, the person trying to help you might be the one you should fear most. But I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. What I discovered next revealed that Millbrook wasn't an isolated case. It was just one small part of something much bigger and more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. 6 months after the Millbrook conspiracy was exposed and the trials began, I thought our nightmare was finally over. I was wrong. What I discovered about my neighbor, Linda Carver, on March 22, 2025, revealed that the conspiracy had tentacles reaching far beyond what any of us imagined, and that some of the people we thought were victims were actually something much more dangerous. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've lived on Maple Street in Millbrook for 12 years. Linda Carver moved in across the street about 3 years ago, right around the time all the strange incidents with the library and mayor's office were starting. At the time, I thought it was just a coincidence. Linda seemed like the perfect neighbor. She was quiet, kept her yard immaculate, and always waved when she saw me working in my garage. She told everyone she was a retired nurse from the state capitol and seemed to genuinely care about the neighborhood's well-being. When the Millbrook conspiracy broke and people started feeling unsafe and paranoid, Linda was one of the few people who actually brought the community together. She organized neighborhood watch meetings, started a phone tree for checking on elderly residents, and even set up a community garden. Everyone loved Linda. She was exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want during a crisis. But there were small things that bothered me, details that didn't quite add up. Linda always seemed to know things about our neighbors before anyone else did. When the Johnsons started having marital problems, Linda mentioned their difficulties weeks before it became obvious. When old Mr. Peterson's health started declining, Linda was already researching assisted living facilities before his family had acknowledged there was a problem. She had an uncanny ability to show up at exactly the right moment when someone needed help. If Mrs. Garcia's garbage disposal was broken, Linda would appear with tools and expertise. If the teenage Mitchell boy was struggling with his car, Linda would somehow have the exact part he needed. Most concerning was how much she knew about the ongoing investigation into the Millbrook conspiracy. She'd share updates about the trials and federal investigation that hadn't been made public yet. When I asked where she got her information, she'd say things like, "I still have friends in healthcare," or, "You hear things when you're involved in community work." The turning point came during a neighborhood watch meeting on March 20th. We were discussing break-ins that had happened in a development about 5 miles away. Linda stood up and said something that made my blood run cold. "We need to be especially careful about anyone asking questions about our daily routines or seeming too interested in our personal lives. The people behind the Millbrook situation weren't just experimenting on residents here. They were gathering intelligence for something much bigger. Some of their associates are still operating, and they're looking for people who might have information about the investigation." The way she said it was chilling. Not like someone passing along a warning she'd heard, but like someone who had direct knowledge of ongoing criminal operations. After the meeting, I started paying closer attention to Linda's behavior. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., Linda would come out to get her newspaper. But she never actually read it. Instead, she'd stand in her driveway for exactly 3 minutes, scanning the street and making note of which cars were in which driveways, which houses had lights on, and who was leaving for work. She had a small notebook that she'd write in before going back inside. In the evenings, she'd work in her front yard garden, but her attention was always focused on the street. She'd watch every car that passed, every person who walked by, and every delivery truck that made stops. Again with the notebook, making entries after each observation. But what really alarmed me was what I saw when I started working late in my garage with the door open. Linda's house had a perfect view of most of the street, and I could see into her living room window. She had what looked like surveillance equipment set up, multiple monitors, cameras, and communication devices that definitely weren't standard home security equipment. On March 21st, I decided to test my suspicions. I made up a story about needing to borrow a ladder and knocked on Linda's door around 7 p.m. She was friendly as always, but when she opened the door, I could see over her shoulder into the living room. She had detailed maps of our neighborhood pinned to the wall, with surveillance schedules and notes about each household's routines. Photos of neighbors, including several of me and my family. And most disturbing, she had printouts of personal information, work schedules, family details, and financial information that no ordinary neighbor should have access to. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Linda said, noticing where I was looking. "I don't actually have a ladder you can borrow. But maybe we should sit down and talk." She invited me in, which I immediately knew was a mistake, but I was too shocked to think clearly. The living room was even worse than what I'd glimpsed from the doorway. Linda had been conducting comprehensive surveillance on every household on our street. File folders for each family with detailed information about work schedules, shopping habits, social activities, and even personal problems like medical issues or financial difficulties. But the most terrifying discovery was a communication log showing that Linda had been reporting our activities to someone she identified only as Regional Coordinator. Daily reports about who was home when, who had visitors, who seemed suspicious or non-compliant with community norms. "Marcus," Linda said, sitting down across from me like we were having a casual conversation, "I think you've been getting the wrong idea about what I do here." "What do you do here, Linda?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm part of a community wellness monitoring program. After what happened with the Millbrook situation, certain agencies realized they needed better intelligence about potential security risks in small communities. People who might be planning to cause problems, who might be involved in criminal activity, or who simply don't fit the profile of stable, productive citizens." She spoke like this was perfectly normal, like comprehensive surveillance of neighbors was a reasonable response to the Millbrook conspiracy. "The people behind the Millbrook operation made mistakes," she continued. "They were too obvious, too aggressive. The new approach is much more sophisticated. We identified potential problems early and addressed them through community intervention rather than medical intervention." "Community intervention?" I asked. "Social pressure, economic consequences, administrative complications. For example, if someone seems to be asking too many questions about local government operations, they might find their business permit applications delayed, or their property tax assessments increased, or their children having difficulties with school enrollment. Much more effective than the crude methods Dr. Wells was using." Linda was describing a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to control community behavior. And she was talking about it like it was a public service. "Who's the regional coordinator you report to?" I asked. She smiled. "Someone who understands that the Millbrook operation was just a pilot program. There are 12 other communities currently under monitoring, and the program is expanding. Rural areas are perfect for testing new approaches to population management because people trust their neighbors and don't expect surveillance." My blood went cold. She was telling me that Millbrook wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger program targeting small communities across the region. "Linda, this is illegal surveillance. You're talking about harassment and intimidation of innocent people." Her expression changed completely. The friendly neighbor mask dropped, and I saw something calculating and cold underneath. "Marcus, you're exactly the type of person this program is designed to identify. You ask too many questions, you don't trust authority, and you have a tendency to interfere in situations that don't concern you. According to my observations over the past 6 months, you exhibit classic markers for antisocial and potentially subversive behavior." She reached for something on the side table, a phone or communication device. I'm going to recommend that you be designated for intensive monitoring and community intervention. Your family too, unfortunately. Your wife's been asking questions about the school board's new policies, and your teenage daughter has been expressing some very concerning political opinions on social media. I realized I was in immediate danger. Linda wasn't just a surveillance operative. She was actively working to destroy the lives of people she deemed problematic. And she had enough personal information about my family to make our lives a nightmare. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, standing up slowly. I'm not anti-authority. I'm just a concerned neighbor. No, Marcus. You're a security risk. But the good news is that we've developed very effective methods for addressing people like you. It usually takes about 6 months of sustained community intervention before targets either modify their behavior or decide to relocate to more suitable environments. She was describing a campaign of organized harassment designed to force people out of their own community. And from the way she talked about it, this wasn't theoretical, she'd done this before. I made an excuse about needing to get home and left as quickly as possible without seeming to panic. But as soon as I was out of her sight, I called David Chin, the city planner who'd exposed the mayor's conspiracy. David, I think we have a serious problem. The conspiracy didn't end with the arrests. It evolved. I told him everything I'd discovered about Linda, and his response was exactly what I'd feared. Marcus, I'd been getting reports from other former Millbrook residents who moved away after the trials. Several of them have contacted me about neighbors in their new communities who seem to know too much about their backgrounds and are causing problems for them. I thought it was just paranoia from the trauma, but what you're describing sounds like organized tracking and harassment. We agreed to meet the next morning and contact state law enforcement together. But that night, things got much worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone in my backyard. When I looked out the window, I saw Linda and 2 people I didn't recognize systematically going through my garbage, taking photos of my house, and doing something to my car. I called 911, but when the police arrived, Linda and her associates were gone. The officers found evidence that someone had placed a GPS tracking device on my car and had attempted to install surveillance equipment near my house. But here's the most disturbing part. The responding officer seemed to already know about Linda and her activities. Mr. Thompson, Officer Williams said, has Ms. Carver been bothering you? We've had a few reports about her behavior, but she claims she's working with federal agencies on some kind of community safety program. Federal agencies. Linda had convinced local law enforcement that her surveillance and harassment activities were legitimate government operations. The next morning, I met with David Chin and we contacted the FBI field office that had handled the Millbrook investigation. What we learned was terrifying. Agent Sarah Mackenzie told us that Linda Carver wasn't her real name. Her actual identity was Linda Morrison, and she was a former employee of the pharmaceutical company that had funded the illegal experimentation program. She'd been arrested during the initial investigation but had been released on bail pending trial. Instead of waiting for her court date, she disappeared and apparently started working for a private intelligence company that was continuing the population monitoring program using improved methods that were harder to detect and prosecute. We've been tracking reports of organized harassment and surveillance in several communities where Millbrook refugees relocated. Agent Mackenzie told us, it appears that the people behind the original conspiracy have evolved their approach. Instead of using medical facilities, they're using private contractors to conduct surveillance and harassment campaigns designed to identify and neutralize people who might expose their operations. Linda Morrison and her associates had been systematically tracking former Millbrook residents and anyone else who might have information about similar programs. They used social pressure, economic sabotage, and legal harassment to silence potential whistleblowers and maintain control over communities they were monitoring. The FBI raid on Linda's house the next day revealed the scope of her operation. She had detailed files on more than 200 people across 6 different communities, communication logs with coordinators in other states, and evidence of a network of surveillance operatives working throughout rural areas across the region. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Linda's operation had been partially funded by legitimate government contracts for community threat assessment and rural security monitoring. The conspiracy had evolved from illegal medical experimentation to quasi-legal surveillance and harassment, making it much harder to prosecute and stop. Linda Morrison was arrested on charges of stalking, harassment, identity theft, and conspiracy. But during questioning, she revealed that the network she was part of had operatives in more than 30 communities across 5 states. The Millbrook operation taught us valuable lessons. She told federal investigators, direct medical intervention was too risky and too obvious. Social and economic intervention is much more effective and much harder to prove in court. People just think they're having bad luck or community problems, not realizing they're being systematically targeted. The investigation that followed Morrison's arrest led to the discovery of one of the largest domestic surveillance and harassment networks in U.S. history. More than 150 operatives were arrested across multiple states, and the government contracts that had funded their activities were terminated and investigated. But what haunts me most is the realization that Linda had been living across the street from me for 3 years, watching my family, documenting our lives, and planning to destroy us if we became inconvenient. She knew our schedules, our habits, our problems, and our vulnerabilities. She'd been preparing to wage psychological warfare against us, and we trusted her enough to let her organize our neighborhood watch meetings. It made me understand that the most dangerous people are often the ones who seem most helpful and trustworthy. Linda had positioned herself as the perfect neighbor specifically so she could gather intelligence and manipulate community dynamics without suspicion. The Millbrook conspiracy hadn't ended with the arrests of the mayor and doctor. It had metastasized into something more subtle and more widespread. And if I hadn't accidentally seen the surveillance equipment in her living room, Linda might have continued her operations for years, destroying lives and silencing potential threats to her network. Have you ever had a neighbor who seemed too helpful, who always knew a little too much about everyone's business? Have you ever felt like someone was watching you a little too closely, or noticed that bad things seemed to happen to people who asked too many questions in your community? Because sometimes, the person organizing your neighborhood watch might be the one you need to watch out for. What happened with Linda Morrison made me realize that surveillance and control can be disguised as community care and safety. And it showed me that some conspiracies don't end when the obvious criminals are arrested. They evolve and adapt, becoming harder to detect but no less dangerous. But even Linda Morrison's network was just the tip of the iceberg. What we discovered next would reveal the true scope of what we'd been dealing with, and why Millbrook had been chosen as a test site for something that threatened communities across the entire country. 1 year after the Linda Morrison surveillance network was exposed, I thought we finally understood the full scope of what had been done to Millbrook and communities like ours. I was wrong. What I discovered about our beloved local musician, Tommy Reed, on August 14, 2025, revealed the most horrifying truth of all, that the entire conspiracy had been designed not just to control us, but to create the perfect cover for something far worse than any of us could have imagined. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and I've been a forensic audiologist for the State Crime Lab for 9 years. When Agent Sarah Mackenzie contacted me about analyzing some unusual audio evidence from the Millbrook case, I thought it would be routine technical work. What I discovered in those recordings changed everything we thought we knew about the conspiracy, and revealed why a deaf musician had been the most dangerous person in our community. Tommy Reed had been Millbrook's most beloved resident for over a decade. He was a talented musician who'd lost his hearing in a car accident at age 25, but had continued his musical career by teaching others and performing at community events using vibrations and visual cues. Everyone loved Tommy. He was inspiring, kind, and seemed to genuinely care about bringing joy to our community through music. Tommy organized the annual Millbrook Music Festival, taught free guitar lessons to local kids, and performed at every wedding, graduation, and community celebration. He had a special gift for working with children, and many parents considered him a positive role model who showed kids that disabilities didn't have to limit their dreams. But when Agent Mackenzie brought me a collection of audio recordings recovered from the underground facilities, she asked me to analyze them for something specific: hidden audio frequencies and embedded communication patterns that might have been used for coordination between the various operatives in the conspiracy. What I found was far more disturbing than coded messages between criminals. The recordings contained sophisticated audio manipulation techniques that were being used for what I can only describe as psychological conditioning. Specific frequency patterns, subliminal audio cues, and rhythmic structures designed to influence behavior and emotional responses in ways that the listeners wouldn't consciously detect. But here's what made my blood run cold. The audio signatures matched exactly with the musical compositions and performances that Tommy Reed had been creating for Millbrook community events over the past 5 years. "Agent Mackenzie," I said during our meeting on August 12th. "This isn't just surveillance equipment. These are recordings of deliberate psychological manipulation using advanced audio techniques. And the source appears to be someone with sophisticated knowledge of both music theory and auditory neuroscience." She leaned forward. "What kind of manipulation?" "Frequency patterns designed to increase suggestibility, reduce critical thinking, and create emotional compliance. The technical term is psychoacoustic conditioning. It's been studied in research settings, but I've never seen it deployed this systematically in a real-world environment." I showed her the analysis on my computer screen. "Look at these waveforms. The music contains subsonic frequencies below the range of conscious hearing, but which can still affect brain activity and emotional state. Combined with specific rhythmic patterns, this could make people more susceptible to authority, less likely to question information, and more inclined to conform to group behavior." Agent Mackenzie stared at the data. "Dr. Walsh, are you telling me that someone has been using music to mind control an entire community?" "Not mind control exactly, but behavioral conditioning. Making people more compliant, more trusting of authority, less likely to ask difficult questions or resist social pressure. And based on these audio signatures, it's been happening at every major community event in Millbrook for years." That's when she told me about Tommy Reed. "Dr. Walsh, we've been investigating Tommy Reed as part of the larger conspiracy. Initially, we thought he might be a victim, someone the conspirators were using because of his disability and community standing. But what you're showing me suggests he might have been a key architect of the entire operation." My stomach dropped. Tommy Reed, the inspiring deaf musician who taught children and brought the community together through music, had been systematically conditioning an entire town to be more susceptible to the very conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. "There's something else," Agent Mackenzie continued. "We've discovered that Tommy Reed isn't actually deaf." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "Medical records show that he underwent experimental cochlear implant surgery 3 years before moving to Millbrook. The surgery was funded by the same pharmaceutical company that sponsored the illegal experimentation program. His deafness has been an elaborate cover story. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me sick. Tommy Reed had been planted in Millbrook as a long-term operative, using his supposed disability to gain trust and access while systematically conditioning the community to be more compliant through his musical performances. Agent Mackenzie, if what you're suggesting is true, then Tommy Reed has been conducting one of the most sophisticated mass psychological manipulation operations I've ever encountered. And he's been using the community's compassion for people with disabilities as a weapon against them. We decided that I needed to analyze Tommy Reed's recent performances directly. Agent Mackenzie arranged for me to attend a community concert that Tommy was giving on August 14th, a healing and recovery event for Millbrook residents who were still traumatized by the revelations about the conspiracy. The irony was devastating. Tommy was positioning himself as someone helping the community recover from a conspiracy that he had helped orchestrate. I attended the concert with specialized recording equipment hidden in my purse, planning to capture and analyze Tommy's performance in real time. What I discovered during that 90-minute concert was the most sophisticated example of mass psychological manipulation I had ever witnessed. Tommy's performance contained multiple layers of conditioning techniques. Subsonic frequencies that induced a state of relaxation and reduced critical thinking. Rhythmic patterns that synchronized with brain wave activity to increase suggestibility. Harmonic structures that triggered specific emotional responses, making the audience more trusting and compliant. And embedded audio cues that were designed to reinforce specific beliefs about authority, community, and the importance of not asking too many questions. But the most disturbing discovery was that Tommy was using real-time monitoring to adjust his performance based on the audience's response. He had small devices that appeared to be hearing aids but were actually sophisticated biometric sensors that could detect heart rate, stress levels, and other physiological indicators from the audience. He was literally conducting a live experiment in mass psychological conditioning, adjusting his techniques based on real-time feedback about how effectively he was manipulating the crowd's mental state. Midway through the performance, I realized something that made my blood freeze. Tommy was looking directly at me, and his performance was starting to focus specifically on my location in the audience. The biometric sensors had detected that I wasn't responding to the conditioning like the rest of the crowd, and he was adapting his technique to target me specifically. I was experiencing a direct psychological attack disguised as a musical performance. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, where I called Agent Mackenzie. Agent Mackenzie, you need to get here now. Tommy Reed is conducting active psychological manipulation on the entire audience, and I think he knows I'm monitoring him. This isn't just evidence of past crimes. This is an ongoing assault on everyone in that room. While I was on the phone, Tommy's performance shifted again. I could hear through the bathroom door that he was now playing music specifically designed to induce anxiety and paranoia. Techniques that would make the audience feel threatened and look for someone to blame for their discomfort. When I returned to the concert hall, I could see the effect immediately. The audience, which had been relaxed and happy, was now agitated and suspicious. People were looking around nervously, and I could see some of them starting to focus their attention on me, the stranger who had left during the performance and returned acting anxious. Tommy Reed was weaponizing the entire audience against me in real time. I tried to leave, but found that other audience members were subtly blocking my path to the exits. They weren't acting aggressively, but they were responding to Tommy's psychological conditioning by unconsciously preventing me from leaving. That's when Agent Mackenzie and a team of federal agents entered the concert hall. The raid that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. As soon as law enforcement appeared, Tommy Reed's entire demeanor changed. The kind, inspiring musician disappeared, and what remained was a cold, calculating operative who immediately began using his sound equipment to try to incite the audience to resist the federal agents. The equipment in the concert hall wasn't just musical instruments. It was a sophisticated psychological warfare system designed to manipulate large groups of people in real time. Tommy had been using Millbrook as a testing ground for techniques that could be deployed anywhere crowds gathered. During the arrest, investigators discovered that Tommy Reed's real name was Dr. Thomas Reichman, and he held a PhD in cognitive neuroscience with a specialty in auditory manipulation techniques. He had been recruited by the conspiracy specifically to develop and test methods for large-scale behavioral conditioning. The cochlear implant surgery had been part of his cover story, but the implants themselves were far more sophisticated than standard medical devices. They contained advanced audio processing capabilities that allowed him to monitor and analyze sound environments in ways that would be impossible for someone with normal hearing. He had been using his supposed disability as a cover for having superhuman auditory capabilities. The investigation that followed Tommy's arrest revealed the true scope of what had been done to Millbrook. The community hadn't just been a test site for medical experimentation, surveillance networks, and harassment campaigns. It had been a comprehensive laboratory for developing techniques to control human behavior on a mass scale. Every major gathering in Millbrook over the past 5 years had been an experiment in psychological conditioning. Town meetings, school events, church services, festivals. Tommy had been present at all of them, systematically conditioning the community to be more compliant, more trusting of authority, and less likely to question unusual activities. The medical experimentation, the surveillance network, the harassment campaigns, all of it had been made possible because Tommy Reed had spent years conditioning the community to be psychologically vulnerable to manipulation. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Tommy's techniques had been refined and were being deployed in dozens of other communities across the country. The conspiracy wasn't just about controlling Millbrook. It was about developing a replicable system for controlling any community where they could plant the right operatives. Dr. Thomas Reichman was charged with conspiracy, assault. The psychological conditioning was classified as a form of assault, fraud, and violations of experimental research protocols. His conviction led to the discovery of a network of similar operatives working in communities across 12 states. The techniques he had developed were found to be so effective that they had been purchased by foreign intelligence agencies and criminal organizations for use in their own psychological operations. But what haunts me most is the realization of how completely the community had been betrayed. Tommy Reed hadn't just been a criminal hiding among them. He had been systematically rewiring their brains to make them more vulnerable to all the other aspects of the conspiracy. Every time a Millbrook resident had felt inspired by Tommy's music, every time they had trusted him with their children, every time they had invited him into their most important life moments, he had been conducting experiments on them. The people of Millbrook hadn't just been victims of a conspiracy, they had been turned into unconscious participants in their own psychological destruction. The federal investigation ultimately led to the prosecution of more than 300 individuals across multiple states, and the exposure of what was classified as one of the most sophisticated domestic psychological warfare operations in U.S. history. But the damage to Millbrook was permanent. Even after all the arrests and trials, the community never fully recovered. Too many people had been too deeply affected by years of psychological conditioning. Families moved away. Businesses closed. The town that had once been close-knit and trusting became suspicious and divided. The conspiracy succeeded in destroying Millbrook even after it was exposed, because you can't undo years of systematic psychological manipulation just by arresting the people responsible. What happened in Millbrook taught me that the most dangerous weapons aren't always guns or bombs or drugs. Sometimes they're ideas, emotions, and the very music that brings communities together. And the most dangerous enemies aren't always the ones who announce themselves as threats. Sometimes they're the ones who inspire us, who teach our children, who we invite into our most precious moments because they seem to represent the very best of human nature. Have you ever felt unusually emotional or compliant after attending a community event? Have you ever noticed that certain music or performances seem to have an almost hypnotic effect on crowds? Because the techniques developed in Millbrook are still out there, being refined and deployed in communities where people trust their local cultural leaders and never suspect that their favorite musicians, speakers, or performers might be conducting experiments on their minds. The Millbrook conspiracy taught us that the most effective way to control people isn't to force them to comply. It's to make them want to comply, to feel good about complying, and to never even realize that they're being controlled at all. And sometimes, the most beautiful music can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.